1943, Solomon Islands. Japanese Zero pilot Lieutenant Yoshio Nakamura watched his entire squadron explode in midair before he even saw the enemy. American P-38 Lightnings were killing from 1,000 yards away, a distance Japanese pilots thought was impossible for aerial combat. But when he was shot down and captured, what he discovered in an American POW camp shocked him far more than any weapon: the terrifying truth about why Japan could never win this war, and it had nothing to do with courage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1943, the sky above the Solomon Islands belonged to Japan. At least, that's what Lieutenant Yoshio Nakamura believed as he climbed into his Mitsubishi Zero fighter at dawn. The air smelled of salt and aviation fuel. His hands moved through the pre-flight checks without thinking. He had done this 200 times before. 8 enemy planes had fallen to his guns. 8 confirmed kills. His squadron mates called him the Hawk. He wore the name with quiet pride. Nakamura was 24 years old. He had trained for 3 years to fly the Zero. The instructors had been brutal. They taught him that death in service to the Emperor was the highest honor a man could achieve. They taught him that American pilots were soft, raised on luxury and comfort, unable to match the spirit of a true warrior. They taught him that the Zero was the finest fighter plane in the world, light, fast, able to turn inside any enemy aircraft. In a dogfight, nothing could beat it. He believed every word. Why wouldn't he? In 1942, Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific like a tsunami. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered in 70 days. The Philippines collapsed. The Dutch East Indies became Japanese territory. The aircraft carrier forces had struck Pearl Harbor and crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Japan seemed unstoppable. But now it was 1943, and things were changing. Nakamura could feel it, even if he didn't want to admit it. The Americans had stopped retreating. They were pushing back, slowly, steadily, and their planes were different now. Bigger, heavier, faster in straight lines, even if they couldn't turn like a Zero. That morning, Nakamura's squadron received orders to intercept American bombers heading toward the Japanese base at Rabaul. 12 Zeros took off in formation. The sun was barely above the horizon. The ocean below them sparkled like broken glass. It was beautiful. Nakamura loved flying more than anything in the world. Up here, he felt free. Up here, he felt invincible. They climbed to 15,000 feet. The air grew cold. Nakamura's breath made small clouds inside his oxygen mask. He scanned the sky constantly, looking for the enemy. The radio crackled with voices. His wingman, Lieutenant Sato, flew just 50 feet to his right. Sato was 19 years old. This was his 8th combat mission. He still had the nervousness of a new pilot, but he was learning fast. Then Nakamura saw them. High above, maybe at 25,000 feet, dark shapes against the blue. Not bombers, fighters, American fighters. But these were strange. They had 2 tails, twin engines. He had heard rumors about this plane. The Americans called it the Lightning, the P-38. Nakamura wasn't worried. The P-38 was big and heavy. It couldn't turn with a Zero. In a dogfight, Japanese pilots would dominate. That's what everyone said. That's what the intelligence reports claimed. American planes were built for speed and firepower, but they lacked the grace and maneuverability of Japanese aircraft. In close combat, the Zero always won. He believed every word. Why wouldn't he? In 1942, Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific like a tsunami. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered in 70 days. The Philippines collapsed. The Dutch East Indies became Japanese territory. The aircraft carrier forces had struck Pearl Harbor and crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Japan seemed unstoppable. But now it was 1943, and things were changing. Nakamura could feel it, even if he didn't want to admit it. The Americans had stopped retreating. They were pushing back, slowly, steadily, and their planes were different now. Bigger, heavier, faster in straight lines, even if they couldn't turn like a zero. That morning, Nakamura's squadron received orders to intercept American bombers heading toward the Japanese base at Rabaul. 12 Zeros took off in formation. The sun was barely above the horizon. The ocean below them sparkled like broken glass. It was beautiful. Nakamura loved flying more than anything in the world. Up here, he felt free. Up here, he felt invincible. They climbed to 15,000 feet. The air grew cold. Nakamura's breath made small clouds inside his oxygen mask. He scanned the sky constantly, looking for the enemy. The radio crackled with voices. His wingman, Lieutenant Sato, flew just 50 feet to his right. Sato was 19 years old. This was his 8th combat mission. He still had the nervousness of a new pilot, but he was learning fast. Then Nakamura saw them, high above, maybe at 25,000 feet, dark shapes against the blue. Not bombers, fighters, American fighters. But these were strange. They had 2 tails, twin engines. He had heard rumors about this plane. The Americans called it the Lightning, the P-38. Nakamura wasn't worried. The P-38 was big and heavy. It couldn't turn with a zero. In a dogfight, Japanese pilots would dominate. That's what everyone said. That's what the intelligence reports claimed. American planes were built for speed and firepower, but they lacked the grace and maneuverability of Japanese aircraft. In close combat, the Zero always won. He keyed his radio. Enemy fighters above, 12 o'clock high, prepare to engage. His voice was calm. He had done this before. The squadron began to climb, but the P-38s were already diving. This was normal. Americans often started with a diving attack to build speed. Then the dogfight would begin, the turning battle, the test of skill. Nakamura's hands tightened on the stick. His heart beat faster, but not from fear, from excitement. This was what he lived for. Nakamura waited for them to close the distance. He prepared to break left, to start the turning fight. His thumb hovered over the firing button for his 20mm cannon. Just a few more seconds, just a little closer. Then Sato's plane exploded. One moment his wingman was there. The next moment there was just a ball of orange fire and black smoke. No warning, no radio call, just gone. Nakamura's mind couldn't process it. The Americans were still too far away. They weren't close to fighting. How could Sato be dead? Another Zero exploded, then another. The radio filled with screaming voices. Nakamura yanked his stick hard left, diving away, trying to understand what was happening. The P-38s weren't coming closer. They were staying high, staying fast, staying far away. And somehow they were killing Zeros from distances that should have been impossible. He saw tracer rounds now, lines of fire reaching out from the P-38s like deadly fingers. But these weren't the scattered streams he was used to. These were concentrated, focused, precise. All the bullets seemed to come from one point on the plane, right down the center line. They didn't spread out. They didn't miss by being off to the sides. They flew straight and true like arrows from the bow of a master archer. Another Zero went down. Nakamura counted. In less than 2 minutes, 5 of his squadron were dead or falling. The Americans hadn't come close. They hadn't entered turning combat. They hadn't fought like warriors. They had simply pointed their noses, fired from 1,000 yards away, and killed. Nakamura felt something he had never felt before in combat. Not fear exactly, something worse, confusion. His training had prepared him for dogfights, for close combat, for tests of skill and courage. But this? This was like being shot by a sniper you couldn't even see. This was like watching your friends die from artillery fire while you stood helpless. He tried to climb, to reach the P-38s, to force them into the kind of fight he understood. But they were already gone, diving away at speeds his Zero couldn't match. using their big engines and heavy airframes to escape before the Japanese could respond. It wasn't cowardly exactly. It was something else. It was calculated, cold, efficient. The remaining Zeros regrouped, 7 planes left out of 12. Nakamura's hands were shaking on the stick. He had never lost so many men so quickly, and he still didn't fully understand how it had happened. The Americans had been so far away. In everything he had learned, and all his training, shooting from that distance was supposed to be a waste of ammunition. You closed in, you got near, then you fired. But the Americans hadn't done that. They had changed the rules. They had fought in a way that made all of Nakamura's training useless. As they flew back to base, Nakamura thought about the P-38's guns. He had seen intelligence photos before. All the weapons were mounted in the nose of the plane, firing straight ahead through the center line. No guns in the wings. No need to calculate convergence angles. Just point and shoot. Like a rifle. Like a sniper weapon designed for the sky. The Zero, by contrast, had guns mounted in the wings. You had to set them to converge at a specific distance, usually around 200 yards. If the enemy was closer or farther than that, your accuracy dropped. It was a limitation every Japanese pilot accepted. It was just how fighters were built. Except the Americans had built something different. They had put all the guns in one place, firing through the propeller arc using synchronization gears, or, in the case of the P-38, firing through the empty space where the propeller would have been because the engines were on the wings. One 20mm cannon, 4 50-caliber machine guns, all firing from the exact same point, all hitting the exact same spot. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it was terrifying. When Nakamura landed, his crew chief ran up to look at his plane. There were bullet holes in the tail. Not many, just a few, but they were there. The American gunners had reached him, even though he thought he was safe, even though he had been dodging and weaving, even though they had been so far away. That night, Nakamura couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He kept seeing Sato's plane exploding, kept seeing the tracer rounds reaching out from impossible distances, kept thinking about the P-38s diving away, untouchable, already gone before the fight could begin.
He thought about something else too, something that bothered him even more. The Americans had so many planes. Every week there were more. Every battle, fresh squadrons appeared. Where were they all coming from? Japan was stretching its resources thin. Factories worked day and night to build Zeros. Skilled workers hand-fitted each part. Each plane took time. Each plane was crafted with care. But the Americans seemed to have an endless supply. How was that possible? How could a nation of soft, luxury-loving people outproduce the disciplined, hard-working Japanese empire? Nakamura didn't have answers, not yet, but he was beginning to suspect that everything he had been told was wrong. Not just about tactics, not just about aircraft design, about everything. 3 weeks later, his Zero took fire from another P-38. The engine seized. The plane started to fall. Nakamura bailed out over the ocean. An American destroyer picked him up 6 hours later. And that's when his real education began. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The American sailors pulled Nakamura from the water with surprising gentleness. He expected brutality. The propaganda had told him Americans were devils who tortured prisoners. Instead, they wrapped him in a dry blanket and gave him water. Real, clean water. Not the brackish stuff he had been drinking on base for the past month. One sailor, barely older than Nakamura himself, offered him a cigarette. Nakamura was too shocked to refuse. On the destroyer, a medical officer examined his injuries. Nakamura had hurt his leg badly during the bailout. The ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. It throbbed with every heartbeat. The doctor gave him something for the pain. Within minutes, the agony faded to a dull ache. Nakamura had never experienced medicine that worked so quickly. In his squadron, injured pilots made do with bandages and willpower. Sometimes sake, if any, was available. But real pain medicine? That was rare. The doctor cleaned the wound and wrapped it carefully. He spoke no Japanese, but his hands were professional and sure. Nakamura thought about zero cockpits. No armor plating behind the seat. No protection for the pilot. Every ounce of weight mattered more than the man flying the plane. The engineers had decided that a lighter aircraft was worth more than a protected pilot. Nakamura had accepted this. It was logical. It was necessary. A warrior shouldn't fear death. But now, watching this American doctor work to save the life of an enemy pilot, Nakamura felt confused. Why waste resources on a prisoner? Why use expensive medicine on someone who had been trying to kill you an hour ago? 2 weeks later, they transferred him to a transport ship heading to the United States. He traveled with 30 other Japanese prisoners. Most were injured. Some were sick with tropical diseases. All received medical care. One man had developed an infection in his arm. The American doctors gave him penicillin. Nakamura had heard of this drug. It was miraculous, supposedly. But Japan didn't have it. The formulas were secret. The production was difficult. Japanese soldiers died from infections that Americans could cure with a simple injection. The infected prisoner's fever broke within 2 days. Nakamura watched the man recover and felt a strange tightness in his chest. How many Japanese soldiers had died from wounds that could have been treated? How many men had his country lost because they lacked this one medicine? The ship arrived in California in August 1943. They took the prisoners to a camp in the desert. Arizona, one of the guards said. Nakamura had never experienced heat like this, dry and relentless. But the camp had shade. The barracks had roofs that worked. Each prisoner had a bed with a mattress, a real mattress, not just a mat on the floor. There were latrines with actual plumbing, running water. Nakamura thought of the field latrines at his airbase in the Solomons. Wooden boxes over pits, always crawling with flies, always smelling of disease.
The first meal shocked him more than anything else. They served rice, but also meat. Real meat, not the tiny portions he had grown used to. There was bread, too, white bread, soft and fresh. A small container of butter, an apple, and milk, fresh, cold milk. Nakamura stared at the food. In Japan, milk has become almost impossible to find. The military took everything. Civilians in the cities were living on rations that grew smaller every month. His own meals at the airbase had been shrinking steadily. Rice and pickles, mostly. Sometimes fish if the supply boats got through. Meat was rare. Fruit was a memory. But here, in this prison camp in America, the enemy was feeding him better than his own country had fed him when he was free. He ate slowly, trying to make sense of it. The other prisoners ate with the same confusion. One man started crying. Another laughed, but it was a bitter sound. They were all thinking the same thing. If this was how America treated prisoners, how well did they treat their own people? 3 days later, a Coca-Cola delivery truck arrived at the camp. Nakamura watched through the fence as guards unloaded cases of the bottles. He had heard of Coca-Cola, a sweet drink, a luxury item. In Japan, the government has banned such things. Luxury was the enemy, the poster said. Every resource had to go to the war effort. Citizens were expected to sacrifice, to endure, to make do with less. But America was giving soda to prison guards during a war, while fighting on 2 fronts, in Europe and the Pacific, and they still had enough sugar to make sweetened drinks for fun. One of the guards noticed Nakamura watching.
The man walked over with a bottle and handed it through the fence. Nakamura took it, unsure what to do. The guard made a drinking motion. Nakamura opened the bottle and took a sip. It was cold, sweet, carbonated, completely unnecessary, completely wasteful, and completely impossible to explain. Nakamura wrote in a small notebook that the camp officials had given him. They encouraged prisoners to keep journals, to write letters home, though he knew the letters would never actually be sent. He wrote, "Do they not know they are at war? How can a nation at war waste sugar on sweetened water?" But even as he wrote the words, he knew the answer. They weren't wasting it. They had so much that giving some to prisoners and guards didn't matter. America had an abundance that Japan couldn't imagine. A month later, they assigned Nakamura to a work detail. The guard said prisoners who cooperated could work outside the camp and earn small amounts of credit for purchases at the camp store. Nakamura agreed. Anything was better than sitting idle. They took him to an aircraft factory, a massive building larger than any structure Nakamura had ever seen. Inside, the noise was incredible. Machines roaring, metal being cut and shaped, rivets being driven. And everywhere, people working. Not just men, women too. Hundreds of women in work clothes, building airplanes. In Japan, women didn't work in factories, not like this. The culture didn't allow it. Men built weapons, women supported from home. But here, women were climbing on wings, operating machinery, and welding metal. And they were fast, skilled, professional. Nakamura's job was simple. He helped move parts from one area to another. But it gave him time to watch, to observe, to understand. He saw P-38s being built, the same planes that had killed his squadron. They moved down an assembly line, slowly taking shape. One station added engines, another attached wings, another installed the gun systems. Each worker did one job over and over, becoming incredibly efficient at that single task. It was nothing like Japanese aircraft production. At home, skilled craftsmen built each plane almost individually. They hand-fitted parts. They took pride in the quality of their work. Each zero was like a piece of art. But this was industry. This was mass production. This was treating airplanes like they were cars or washing machines. Build them fast, build them cheaply, build so many that losing some didn't matter. Nakamura overheard a foreman talking to another supervisor. "We're behind schedule this month," the man said. "Only 387 planes. We need to pick up the pace." 387 planes in 1 month from one factory, and they were calling it behind schedule. Nakamura thought about his airbase. Maybe one new zero arrives per week, sometimes less. And each one was precious, irreplaceable. Every loss hurts. But America was building hundreds, and they thought it was slow.
One evening, an American engineer came to talk to the prisoners. The camp held educational sessions sometimes. This engineer wanted to explain aircraft design. He brought diagrams of the P-38. He showed the prisoners how the centerline gun system worked. "All the weapons fire through the nose," the engineer explained. "No wing guns means no convergence problems. You don't have to calculate angles, you just aim and shoot. It's effective at much longer ranges than wing-mounted systems." He said it casually, like it was obvious, like it was just common sense. Nakamura raised his hand. "But what about the honor of close combat?" he asked in broken English. The engineer looked confused. "Honor? Why risk the pilot when you can hit from 1,000 yards away? It's just engineering. We're solving problems. Just engineering. Not a test of courage, not a measure of warrior spirit. Just solving problems. Making systems that worked. Building tools that did the job efficiently." Nakamura lay awake that night, thinking. Japan had told him that spirit could overcome material, that willpower and dedication could defeat mere numbers.
That one Japanese warrior was worth 10 American soldiers because of superior fighting spirit. But it wasn't true. The Americans had built a system. They had factories that produced hundreds of planes per month. They had medicine that saved lives. They had food abundance that let them feed prisoners better than Japan fed its own pilots. They had designed weapons that killed from distances that Japanese doctrine said were impossible. And they had done all of it by treating war like an engineering problem, not a spiritual test, not a proof of cultural superiority, just a problem to be solved with math and metal and millions of workers. Nakamura finally understood. He and his fellow pilots had been fighting an equation they could never balance. Japan had brought courage and skill to the war. America had brought industry and systems. And in the end, the system always won. December 1944 arrived cold and clear in the Arizona desert. Nakamura had been a prisoner for 16 months. He had stopped counting the days. Time moved differently here, slower, quieter. He spent his days working at the factory, watching Americans build weapons that would kill his countrymen. He spent his nights writing in his journal and trying not to think about home. Then the guards announced that Christmas was coming. They told the prisoners there would be a special meal. Nakamura didn't understand Christmas well. He knew it was an important holiday for Christians. Something about a baby and a star, the details were fuzzy. But he understood that Americans celebrated it with food and family. On Christmas Day, the camp kitchen prepared a feast. Nakamura couldn't believe what he saw when he entered the mess hall. Turkey, mountains of it. Each prisoner received a piece larger than any portion of meat Nakamura had eaten in 2 years. There were mashed potatoes with butter melting into them. There was stuffing thick with herbs. There were vegetables, green beans swimming in sauce. There was bread, fresh and warm. And there was pie. Apple pie with a golden crust and a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting on top. Ice cream. In the middle of a war. For prisoners. Nakamura sat at the long table with the other Japanese prisoners. Nobody spoke. They just stared at the food. One of the older men started to cry silently. Tears ran down his face and into his rice bowl. Another man picked up his fork and then put it down again, as if he had forgotten how to eat. Nakamura thought about his family in Japan. His mother and father lived in Yokohama. His sister had married a factory worker in Osaka. Before he left for the war, rations had already been tight. His mother had stopped eating rice so that his father and sister could have more. She said she wasn't hungry, but Nakamura had seen how thin she was getting. That was in 1942. Now it was late 1944. How much worse had things become? He had heard rumors from new prisoners. Food shortages were severe. Cities were being bombed. People were starving. The government had started collecting metal from temples and shrines. They were melting down bells that had rung for centuries. They were taking pots from kitchens. Anything that could be turned into weapons. And here he sat, a prisoner of the enemy, eating turkey and ice cream. The bitter irony cut deeper than any wound he had received in combat. His country was starving while fighting a war. America was feeding its prisoners luxury meals while fighting the same war. The contrast was so stark it felt unreal, like a dream or a propaganda film. But it was real. The turkey was real. The ice cream was real. And somewhere across the ocean, his mother was probably eating watered-down rice and calling herself lucky to have it. After the meal, some of the American guards came around with cigarettes. They were in a good mood. One of them, a young man from Iowa named Miller, sat down next to Nakamura. Miller had been friendly before. He sometimes practiced Japanese words with the prisoners. His pronunciation was terrible, but Nakamura appreciated the effort. Miller offered Nakamura a cigarette and lit it for him. They sat in silence for a moment, smoking and watching the desert sunset turn the sky orange and purple. "My dad's been writing me letters," Miller said. "He says this whole war is stupid. He just wants me to come home for harvest season. We grow corn, lots of corn, more than we can sell sometimes." Nakamura looked at him. "You think war is stupid?" Miller shrugged. "Don't you? I mean, no offense, but I don't have anything against you personally. You were doing your job, I'm doing mine. But yeah, I think it's stupid. I'd rather be home. I bet you would too." Nakamura didn't know how to respond. In Japan, you don't call war stupid. War was sacred when the emperor commanded it. War was duty. War was the ultimate test of a man's worth. To call it stupid was to insult the thousands who had died. To call it stupid was to question everything the nation stood for. But sitting there in the fading light, stomach full of turkey, Nakamura realized that Miller's words made sense. Why were they fighting? What was the point? Japan wanted territory and resources. America wanted to stop Japan from taking territory and resources. Thousands of men were dying over islands and strategic positions. And for what? So that Miller could go home to Iowa and grow corn? So that Nakamura could go home to Yokohama and see his mother again? Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all that mattered. Not glory, not honor, not proving which nation was superior. Just going home. The thought felt dangerous, revolutionary, but also true. Over the following months, Nakamura talked more with the guards and the other prisoners. He learned that most American soldiers didn't hate the Japanese. They were just trying to survive and finish the job so they could leave. They didn't fight for ideology. They fought because their country told them to, and they wanted it to be over. This was completely different from everything Nakamura had been taught. Japanese soldiers were supposed to embrace death. American soldiers just wanted to avoid it. Japanese soldiers fought for the emperor and the glory of the nation. American soldiers fought to get back to their normal lives. And yet, somehow, the Americans were winning. In August 1945, news reached the camp that changed everything. 2 bombs had been dropped on Japan, cities called Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Single weapons that destroyed entire cities in an instant. Tens of thousands died in seconds. And a few days later, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Nakamura sat in his bunk and tried to process the information. A bomb that destroyed a whole city? He couldn't picture it. His mind refused to accept it. But then he thought about the P-38s and their centerline guns. He thought about the factories producing hundreds of planes every month. He thought about ice cream, Coca-Cola, and medical care. He pulled out his journal and wrote, "They built a bomb the way they built the P-38. Not with honor, not with sacrifice, but with mathematics and metal. We believed spirit could overcome matter. We were wrong. The centerline guns were just the beginning. We were fighting an equation we could never balance." He sat back and read his own words. Everything made sense now. The P-38 wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol. It represented a completely different way of thinking about war. Japan had approached war as a spiritual test. America had approached it as an engineering problem. Japan valued courage and individual skill. America had valued systems and mass production. And when spirit faced off against the system won. Every time. Nakamura thought about all the brave pilots he had known, all the skilled warriors, all the men who had died believing their sacrifice would make the difference. They had been brave. They had been skilled. But they had been fighting against an opponent who didn't care about bravery or skill. An opponent who just kept building more planes, training more pilots, and shooting from 1,000 yards away, where courage didn't matter.
The Americans hadn't beaten Japan by being better warriors. They had beaten Japan by being better engineers. The repatriation ship arrived at Yokohama in March 1946. Nakamura stood at the rail with hundreds of other former prisoners, watching Japan emerge from the morning mist. He had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, coming home, seeing his family, walking on Japanese soil again. But now that it was actually happening, he felt only dread. The harbor was destroyed. Blackened concrete and twisted metal lined the waterfront. Buildings stood like hollow teeth, their walls intact, but everything inside burned away. Cranes lay toppled in the water. Ships rusted at broken docks. The smell hit him before they even landed. Smoke and ash and something else, decay. The smell of a nation that had been bombed into submission. They processed the returning prisoners slowly. American occupation soldiers checked papers and asked questions through translators. Japanese officials stood nearby, watching but not in charge. That was new. Japan had always been in charge. Even when things went badly, Japan controlled Japan. But not anymore. Now American soldiers directed traffic in downtown Tokyo. American flags flew over government buildings. The emperor himself had announced the surrender on the radio, his voice high and thin, using words nobody really understood, but everyone knew meant defeat. Nakamura received his discharge papers and a small amount of money. Enough for a train ticket, they said, enough to get started. He thanked them and walked out into the city he no longer recognized. The train station was crowded with people who looked like ghosts, thin faces, hollow eyes, clothes that hung loose on skeletal frames. Children sat on the platform with hands outstretched, begging for food. Old women sold bits of family treasure for a few coins. A man tried to trade a silk kimono for a bag of rice. The kimono had probably been in his family for generations. Now it was worth less than 10 pounds of grain. Nakamura bought his ticket and waited for the train to his hometown. In his bag, he carried the few possessions he had accumulated as a prisoner. His journal, a POW camp newsletter that the Americans had let them publish, some mechanical drawings he had sketched from memory at the factory, a chocolate bar that Miller had given him as a farewell gift, and English language skills that he had learned from talking to guards and reading American magazines. These things felt like treasures from another world. In America, they were ordinary. Here, they were precious. The chocolate bar alone was worth more than most people earned in a week. The train moved slowly through the countryside. Nakamura looked out the window and saw devastation everywhere. Cities reduced to ash, factories bombed flat, rice fields untended because there was no one left to work them. The young men were dead or still returning from overseas. The old men had died during the war from overwork and starvation. That left women and children to rebuild an entire nation from rubble. He arrived in his hometown after dark. The streets were mostly empty. No lights in the windows because electricity was rationed. No cars because gasoline didn't exist. Just darkness and silence and the sound of his own footsteps. His family's house was still standing, though the roof had been damaged by fire. Someone had patched it with scrap metal and tar paper. Nakamura stood outside for a long moment, gathering courage. Then he knocked. His mother opened the door. She looked 20 years older than when she had left. Her hair had gone completely white. Her face was deeply lined. Her body was so thin that her clothes looked like they belonged to someone else. But her eyes lit up when she saw her, and she made a sound that was half cry, half laugh. She pulled her inside. The house was cold. There was no fuel for heating. His mother had been sitting by a tiny charcoal brazier, trying to stay warm. She made tea from leaves that had probably been used 3 times already. The water was barely colored, but she served it like it was the finest beverage in the world. They sat together and talked. Nakamura learned that his father had died in the winter of 1945. Starvation, his mother said, though the official cause was listed as heart failure. He had given most of his food rations to his wife and had worked at a munitions factory until his body simply gave out. His sister was alive, but her husband had died in the Philippines. She was living in Osaka with her 2 children, trying to find work in a city that had no jobs. His mother asked about America, about the prison camp. Nakamura didn't know how to explain. How could he tell her that he had eaten better as a prisoner than she had eaten as a free citizen? How could he describe ice cream and Coca-Cola and turkey dinners to a woman who was proud to have a bowl of watered-down rice? Instead, he gave her the chocolate bar. She held it like it was made of gold. She wanted to save it to make it last, but Nakamura insisted she eat it right then. He watched her take small bites, closing her eyes, probably tasting sweetness for the first time in years. When she finished, she cried. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming emotion of a simple pleasure that had been absent for so long.
The next day, Nakamura walked through the town. He passed the old airfield where he had first learned to fly. It was destroyed. The hangar was a collapsed ruin. The runway was cratered and unusable. Wreckage of Zero fighters lay scattered around the field like the bones of dead animals. Some had been stripped for parts. Others were just melting into the earth, slowly rusting away. He found a piece of a Zero's wing and ran his hand over the metal. Once, these planes had been the pride of Japan, the finest fighters in the world. He had believed that with his whole heart. But standing there in the ruins, he understood the truth. The Zero had been good because Japan couldn't build anything better with the resources they had. They had made it light because they didn't have enough metal for armor. They had made it maneuverable because they didn't have powerful engines. They had made it beautiful because beauty cost nothing. The P-38 had been heavy because America had metal to spare. It had been fast because they built massive engines. It had fired from 1,000 yards away because they could afford to put all the guns in one place and not worry about the extra weight. Japan was built with scarcity. America was built with abundance. And in the end, abundance won. He met a former squadron mate a few days later. Lieutenant Tanaka had survived the war but lost his right arm to a P-38's guns over the Philippines. He now works as a clerk, writing with his left hand. They sat in a noodle shop that served bowls so small they were almost symbolic. More broth than noodles. But it was warm, and they were grateful. Tanaka talked about honor and duty, about how they should have died in combat instead of surviving to see defeat, about how surrender was shameful. His words had the sound of official propaganda, the things men were supposed to say. But his eyes looked tired and empty. Nakamura said quietly, "We died honorably every day. That was the problem." Tanaka looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "We were taught to embrace death. They were taught to avoid it. We were taught to value courage. They were taught to value results. We kept dying honorably, while they kept building more planes. And now we're sitting here in the ruins while they're eating steaks in California." Tanaka was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You shouldn't talk like that. People will think you've been corrupted by American ideas." "Maybe I have," Nakamura said. "Or maybe I just learned the truth." In 1947, Nakamura found work as a translator for the American occupation forces. His English was good enough, and the Americans paid in real currency that could buy actual food. Some people in the town looked at him with suspicion, a traitor working for the enemy. But Nakamura didn't care. His mother needed to eat. His sister's children needed to eat. Honor didn't feed anyone. Through his work, he met American engineers who were helping to rebuild Japanese industry. He listened to them talk about production methods and efficiency and systems thinking. He recognized the same philosophy that had built the P-38, the same approach that had won the war. And he realized that Japan needed to learn these lessons if it was ever going to recover. In the 1950s, Nakamura got a job with Toyota. The company was struggling, trying to figure out how to compete in a world where America made better cars cheaper and faster. Nakamura shared what he had learned in the aircraft factory: the assembly line approach, the interchangeable parts, the focus on efficiency over craftsmanship. Some of the older engineers resisted. They believed in the traditional way: quality over quantity, pride in individual work. But the younger engineers listened. They understood that Japan couldn't afford to be romantic about manufacturing anymore. They had to be practical. They had to be efficient. They had to build systems, not just products. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. The economy grew. Companies like Toyota and Sony became world leaders. And they did it by learning the lessons that Nakamura had learned as a prisoner of war. Systems over spirit.
efficiency over honor, results over courage. By the 1990s, Nakamura was an old man. His hair was white. His hands shook from age. But universities invited him to give lectures about the war and about Japanese industrial recovery. He always brought the same proc, a photograph of a P-38 Lightning. At one lecture, a young engineering student asked him, "Were you angry that the Americans didn't fight fairly, that they shot from so far away?" Nakamura smiled. It was a question he had been asked many times. He had given many answers over the years. But now, at the end of his life, he had settled on the truthest one. Fair? He said. War isn't fair. War is about survival. And I learned something important from that P-38 and its centerline guns. A warrior who believes in death can be brave. But a nation that believes in life will be efficient. And efficiency, in the end, is the only honor that matters when the survival of your people is at stake.
He pointed to the photograph. They built 10,000 of these planes. We shot down hundreds, maybe thousands, but they just kept building more. Because they weren't fighting for glory or honor or to prove their spirit was superior. They were fighting to win and go home. And that's why they won. The students were quiet. Nakamura looked at their faces and saw them processing this information. Saw them understanding that everything their grandparents had believed about the war was built on false assumptions. The P-38 taught me something from 1,000 yards away, Nakamura said. It taught me the future. It taught me that the world belongs to those who build systems, not to those who celebrate sacrifice. We just didn't want to see it until it was too late. A few months later, Nakamura visited an aviation museum. They had restored a P-38 Lightning and put it on display. He stood in front of it for a long time, looking at the twin tails and the centerline gun package. The machine that had killed so many of his friends. The machine that had shot him down. The machine that had taught him the most important lesson of his life. He reached out and placed his hand on the cold metal of the gun housing. After all these years, after all the pain and loss and transformation, he felt something unexpected. Gratitude. This plane had defeated him, but in doing so, it had also educated him. It showed him a better way. Not just a better way to fight wars, but a better way to think about problems, to build solutions, to create abundance instead of managing scarcity. Japan had lost the war, but in losing, it had learned how to win the peace. And that lesson had come from a twin-tailed fighter with centerline guns that could kill from distances that seemed impossible. Nakamura whispered to the silent aircraft, "Thank you for the lesson. I'm sorry it took so much death to learn it." He turned and walked slowly toward the exit. Behind him, the P-38 stood silent and still, a monument to the truth that efficiency will always defeat ideology, and that the nations which learn this lesson fastest are the ones that survive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.